Okay, so it seems that we are live now. So, hello everyone. I would like to welcome you to Kentico's Design Hour. And my name is Adam, and I'm going to be your host today for the next about 60 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And this Design Hour is kind of special because this is the first time we are doing it online due to circumstances, obviously, but we decided that's not going to stop us. And it's also the first one that we are doing in English to open it up to for international folks. So I hope this is going to be interesting for you. We're going to have some fun. And let's look at what we'll hear about today. You already know we are going to be talking about prototyping tools, and the whole talk will have two parts. In the first one, we will talk about choosing a prototyping tool. I'm going to talk about what kinds of problems I see with prototyping tools. What are some antidotes to those problems, and how can you actually choose the proper tool? And I'm going to show you a couple of real life examples as well. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about live data prototypes. I'm going to tell you what they are, how they work. I'm going to show you a little case study about how we used live data prototypes in Kentico recently. And at the very end, I'm going to share some lessons and tips from that experience. After all that, we're going to hold a short Q&A session. During the whole talk, you can ask your questions on Sli.do. So you can go to Sli.do.com or Sli.do, and you can use the hashtag Design Hour. And during the whole talk, you can ask questions, and we will, or I will, answer them at the very end. So let's dive right in. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Adam Amran, and I'm currently a UX designer at Kentico. And I've been in the field of UX design for, 8 years now? That's a pretty long time. And during that time, I've worked on dozens and dozens of prototypes, big and small, simple and complex. And I've used a variety of tools over the years, ranging from InVision to Marvel, Axure, Framer, Figma, Sketch, and even some code. And with that many tools on the market today, and this is just a fraction of tools available, it can be quite hard to choose a prototyping tool, I think. And let's talk about that. As I said, with that many tools, it might be tempting to ask a question, what's the best prototyping tool out there? Which tool is the best tool? And maybe there are some contenders for that title. I mean, you have Axure, which is one of my favorite tools. That's very robust, very powerful. You've got Framer. Maybe that's the best prototyping tool out there. You can do pretty much anything in code. Or maybe it's some other magical, omni-powerful tool. I'm going to keep this question open, and maybe we will find an answer to it during this talk. Let's turn our attention to some problems that I see with prototyping tools today. And to be honest, I think those problems aren't actually with the tools themselves, but rather with us designers. And let me see what I mean by that. So I see two biggest problems when it comes to prototyping. And the first one is law of the instrument. Now, that label may not be very familiar to you, but you probably know the saying that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think a prototyping can be a lot like that. When you have that one favorite tool that you like to use for everything, it can cause some problems for you. I mean, even if you have just one tool in your toolbox, it can create really, really big problems, because when you use one tool for everything, it can happen that you might get stuck like this. And this is no place to be. So for example, if all you know, or if all you use is InVision, and I have nothing against InVision, it's a brilliant tool. It has its place on the market, sure. But what do you do when you need to prototype something that requires conditional logic or variables or maybe some interactive form elements? If InVision is your only tool, you're going to get stuck simply because that tool just has its limits. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got these very powerful tools like Axure. And when that tool is your go-to tool for everything, it can paradoxically be very difficult to prototype even some very basic, for example, mobile app transitions. And trust me, I've tried that. It's horrible. So even with powerful tools, you can run into problems that make you less efficient. And at the end of the day, prototyping really is a lot about efficiency. You want to be as efficient as possible because at the end, the prototype you're producing is just for validating your ideas, and you're going to throw it away in the very end. So that's the law of instrument. The second problem I see is over prototyping, and it's somewhat related because when you have a powerful tool, it can be very easy to overdo your prototypes. I think designers often end up with something like this for a prototype, and I've certainly been guilty of that as well. You prototype these huge prototypes, very complex ones. You try to cover every case, and it can be fun, I admit, but maybe all you need is this in the end. And I think a very good concept to think about this is the Goldilocks quality. I borrowed this from the book Sprint, and I think this captures it really nicely because as you invest time in prototypes, you can try and make them more and more real, but after a certain threshold, you are simply wasting time because it's not gonna help you achieve your goals more quickly or more efficiently. And I think we should all strive for avoiding that over prototyping zone. As I said, we have to remember that the prototypes we make will ultimately be thrown away, and they are here just to help us validate our ideas or communicate them to our teams. So we have these two problems, the law of the instrument and over prototyping. So I think these can really originate from the choice of our tools. And I wanted to look at a couple of antidotes that can help us avoid these problems. So antidote number one is really the basics. It's about building a diverse toolbox. What you want when it comes to prototyping is something like this. You want to go from having just a hammer to having a wide range of tools. And okay, I admit maybe you don't need all these tools. Maybe you don't need to have like 20 of them, but it's good to have at least a couple to have that choice when you are presented with some task or some project so that you can choose the best tool for that job. I'm going to show you my personal toolbox. In Kentico, in the design team, we are using Sketch. So that's the basic tool that I use. If I wanted to build some prototype with just very basic, linking of screens, that's what I would probably use. And I complement that with Framer and Axure, which are two quite powerful tools. I've been using them for years. And the reason I use them today is because most of the prototypes that I need to do are usually somewhat complex or require some special things like conditional logic or interactive form elements. And these are the tools that I found work best for these requirements that I usually have. And recently I've been trying to learn to code, and another tool, if you want to call it that, could be using code for prototyping, and I've been experimenting with that a little bit, but this is just a marginal tool for me right now. What's important about toolboxes is that they change over time. When you look at my toolbox here, it didn't look like this a couple of years ago, or even just a year ago. It constantly changes, based on my current needs about what I need to prototype, but also with the tools that my team uses. It's not always up to me to choose whatever tool that I would like. So Toolbox changes over time, and because of that, I think we need to make sure that we know what's out there. And I mean, designers should constantly learn and experiment and explore what tools are available, what tools could make them more efficient, better at prototyping in general. And a good source for that could be this website called uxtools.co, which offers a very good comparison of not just prototyping tools, but a whole range of design tools. So if you go there, you can get a very good look at what the market offers right now, and you can compare which tools might be a good addition to your toolbox. And when you go do that, I think very good advice is to make that toolbox as diverse as possible. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's say that you have InVision as your go-to tool right now, and you want to add something else. If you go and add, for example, Marvel, I mean, it would probably make your options a little bit wider, but Marvel is only marginally different from InVision, as far as I can remember. I mean, if the situation has changed, then good for Marvel, but you generally want to add tools that are radically different in capabilities from the tools that you already use or know. If instead of Marvel, you went and explored UXPin and learned how to use it, you would be much better off, because now you have a tool that's great for simple prototypes, simply connecting screens quickly, like InVision, and you have a tool that's great for complex prototypes, like UXPin, because it allows you to work with form elements, variables, and you name it. So right now, if you get these two tools, for example, this is just an example, you have much wider capability about what you can prototype. And what I found during my career is that there are basically, or usually, three use cases for prototyping. And I think your toolbox should cover those. And in my view, those are simple flows, animations, and complex prototypes. I'm just gonna name a couple of examples, but there are so many tools out there that you should go and explore. But for simple flows, you could use, for example, InVision or Figma. For animations, you could use Principle or Origami, maybe even Framer. For complex prototypes, Axure, obviously, UXPin as well. Again, I'm gonna name Framer. But there's also the alternative of live data prototypes that I'm gonna talk about in a little bit. But this is just my suggestion, and you will find that your use cases might differ. So it really comes down to understanding what your prototyping needs are and making sure that the toolbox that you built covers those needs so that you are able to prototype efficiently. So that's the antidote number one, building a diverse toolbox. Antidote number two to those problems that I presented earlier would be to have a choice framework. So, now that we've built this toolbox, you have this abundance of choice, let's say, and you reach a point where you get a new project and you need to prototype something. Yeah. So now what? Like, how do you choose between those tools that you have at your disposal? What I found that helps me is to have this simple framework consisting of a couple of questions that helps me point me to the best tool for the job. The first question that I ask myself is, what is the goal of the prototype? What do I want to accomplish with this? Is it to test a feature with users? Is it to fine-tune an animation? Is it to communicate the interaction to my team? And when I answer that, it can already point me toward some tool from my toolbox, but sometimes I need to dig a little bit deeper, and I need to cover what exactly I need the prototype to do. And I have this set of questions that help me do that. You can, for example, ask yourself if you will need to use real data in your prototype, or if you need to use the prototype on a specific device, for example, or maybe if you are going to be handing it off to developers later. These are all questions that can point you to the good direction, like which tool to choose. But in order to be able to know which tool will be the best based on answers to these questions, you have to know your tools well. You have to know their limits. And that's why I think it's very important to really explore the tools that you have and become really familiar and comfortable with them. And that actually leads me to a third question of this framework, and that is, how proficient am I with a certain tool? Because sometimes it can be tempting to choose this hip new tool that I've heard about, but if you are using it for a real project and you are not really familiar with the tool, it can happen that you get stuck. And that's what happened to me with Framer. You knew I was going to talk about Framer, right? It's a powerful tool, sure, but it requires coding, and that's a skill that's built over time. It has a very steep learning curve. I'm talking about Framer Classic here, not Framer X, just for clarification. But it happened to me a couple of times that I was excited about Framer and I thought it was a great fit for a project that I was working on, only to find that I'm limited by my coding abilities and that I get stuck and that I'm not as efficient as I would want to be when I'm prototyping, which is one of the goals in prototyping, I think. So my advice would be to really learn a tool properly before using it for real projects. You don't have to master it first, but you just want to make sure that you don't get stuck because you haven't learned to properly operate a tool. At the end of the day, it's much easier to be efficient with the appropriate tool, and that's what this overall framework can help you do. It can point you to a tool that's the most appropriate for the project that you have. Antidote number 3 isn't actually related to tools, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's a really good antidote to the problem of over-prototyping. And it's only relevant when the prototype that you're doing is going to be used for user testing, but still, when I prototype and I know that the prototype is going to be used for user testing, I always make the test script first, and only then do I prototype. Why? When you prototype first, it's very tempting to do all these interactions, to do all these things. And let's say that you create a prototype and it does 4 things, yeah? And you have the prototype and then you go and make your testing script. And in that script, you have, for example, 2 scenarios. And only then you find out, oh, to cover these scenarios, people are probably going to be using just 2 of those things in the prototype. Like the other 2 things are going to be redundant. So now you've wasted all that time prototyping those 2 redundant things. Whereas if you made the script first and only then do you start prototyping, you would only prototype what is necessary to cover those scenarios in that script, which I think is much more efficient and it saves you time. So we've been talking about all these theoretical things, but I want to show you some real life examples as well. And for that, let me quickly jump out of the presentation. And the first example that I have is from a project that I worked on, one of the first projects that I worked on when I joined Kentico, and it was a redesign of commenting functionality in the product. And in there, we had previously comments that were lumped together in one group, and they weren't really positioned near the content that they belonged to. And I'm gonna open up, if that works, yeah. I'm gonna open up this content item in the prototype, and this is actually after the redesign. And these comments are aligned with the content that they belong to. And if I scroll down, you will see that these are aligned as well. And what I needed to prototype was the positioning of these comments, because as you clicked on them, as you focused on some of those, you would need to position them differently. And the other thing that I wanted to prototype was the changing of states, because as you can, for example, see here, this is a comment that's been unread, so it looks a little bit different. and this is a thread that has more comments and it's collapsed. And I needed to prototype these states in order to test that people understand the states and can use the functionality in general. And when I was deciding which tool to use for that, I was thinking between Framer and maybe Axure, but as those are the main prototyping tools in my toolbox. And when I thought about animating things like this in Axure, it would be a real headache. And that's pretty much why I chose Framer for this. Even though maybe other tools, if I knew my way around those, would be better for the job. Maybe Principle, I'm not sure. But with what I had available to me at that moment, Framer seemed like the best choice. Another prototype, just a very small prototype that I want to show you, is this very little guy done in code. And here, this is just to communicate in an interaction to my team. This was not to test it with people. This was not to fine-tune an animation or anything, just to communicate how an interaction would work. And it's about expanding and collapsing a nested element within a content item. And when you scroll down, it's a header here. The prototype is very crude, but the header here is sticky. And all I needed to do was to communicate this. This was all. And at the time, I did that a couple of months ago. At the time, I hadn't used Framer for quite a bit, and I knew that my ability to code faded a little bit. So I thought, hey, maybe I can prototype this in code. Maybe this would be better. And actually, it took me like not even an hour to prototype this. And if I used Framer for that, I would be very in a pickle, because I was learning JavaScript at the time of doing this, and so my knowledge of that was better. My proficiency of that was actually better, and that allowed me to be more efficient with this. And that's why I chose code as the prototyping tool of choice for that. So those were just a couple of small examples that I wanted to show you of how I thought about choosing the tools for some prototypes. What are some takeaways from all of this? I think the number one takeaway is really to build a diverse toolbox, because only when you have multiple tools at your disposal will you be best positioned to make the best choice for the project at hand. And when you do, you want to choose a tool based on the needs of the prototype that you are going to do. You need to map those needs, answer those questions about what exactly is the prototype going to do, what's the goal of the prototype. And you also want to consider your proficiency in the tool, because that's what will determine how efficient you are going to be as well. And we are coming back to the question that I asked in the beginning, and that's what's the best prototyping tool? And I think by now you can probably guess that the best tool is the one that fits what you need to prototype. There is no one tool to rule them all. I'm sorry if you hoped for a big revelation like this is the tool. That's not gonna happen. But I really think that different projects really need different prototypes, and so they require different tools so that you are most efficient. So we have talked about these traditional prototyping tools, and this begs the question, are they really the only way to prototype? And my answer to that would be, oh, hell no. I think what's interesting and what's been on display for quite some time, but people haven't used it a lot, are live data prototypes. I think I encountered an article from way back 2011, I think, from Marty Kagan, who talks about these prototypes. So the idea has been around for, 9 years now. but they aren't widely used. And I think that's a shame. I think they are a wonderful tool, although it should be used sparingly, and I will talk about that. And let me start with what they actually are, because you might not have a very good idea. In short, live data prototypes are prototypes that exist in code. They usually exist on top of a real running product, and they use live data. That's the most crucial part. I'm going to talk about what that means in a second. And because they do use live data, they provide the most realistic context during validation. And that, I think, is really important to note, because the best use case, I believe, for live data prototypes is when you need to validate something with users. It's not really to prototype some cool interaction or something. What's good about live data prototypes is also that they involve developers in the process. In our team, in Kentico, we've been trying to involve developers as much as possible during the design process, and this is a wonderful way of doing that. So let me go back a little bit to that live data term and what it actually means. In short, when I say live data, I actually mean users' own data, like the data that users sees when they log into your app or into your product. And maybe it's worth a deeper look at what kinds of data you can use in prototyping or design in general. This is something that I like to call hierarchy of data relevance in design. And it's this pyramid that the higher you go up the pyramid, the more relevant data you have. And ideally, in an ideal world, you want to be as high as possible without sacrificing too much time. That's important to note. At the very bottom, you can see that you have these fake dummy data, and as you go up, you have realistic looking data, real data, and at the very top, you've got live data. Maybe we can look at an example of how this data differs between themselves. This is a graphic from an article by Peter Vermeer, who wrote a great article called Data-Driven Design. And it really shows the difference between these kinds of data in design or in prototyping. And on the very left, you've got the fake data, which you can also call lorem ipsum. And as you can see, this is just made up data that doesn't make really any sense. In the middle, you've got realistic looking data, something that you might call the dribble. And it's the data that looks just right, just perfect, but they are also made up. They look real, but they are made up. And on the right, you've got real data that, in this case, I think are pulled from some API. And immediately you see that these data can actually show you some shortcomings in your designs, like we see here with the label overflowing into the time. But what's important about these differences between these data is that the more relevant you go, the more difficult it is to work with that data. It is very easy to think up some fake data. It is very easy, or it's a little bit more difficult to make up some realistic looking data. It's quite a bit more effort to get some real data and to work with it in your designs. And with live data, you are at the pinnacle of the pyramid, but you also have the highest difficulty of actually getting them and using them. And in order to do that, you're going to need help of your developers, probably, unless you are yourself able to code. And you might ask, is it worth going through that trouble? Like, why would you do that? And I think that data relevance really matters when you're doing user testing or during validation in general. This doesn't really mean that it's always desirable to have the most relevant user data when you are testing something, but sometimes it is really, really useful to have the relevance, because live data, they give people context and familiarity of their environment, and so they help you during user testing by enabling you to uncover insights that you wouldn't have with real data. And that's the key difference, I think, here. And then it's actually the biggest benefit of using live data. And because of that, as I said earlier, I believe that live data or live data prototypes work best for testing features that rely heavily on user data. I'm going to be frank here, they aren't applicable everywhere. And these situations where you have some feature that really relies heavily on user data is what I think is the best use case for live data prototypes. And this is all very theoretical, so let's look at a case study of how we used live data prototypes or live data prototype recently in Kentico. And that was when we were designing in-app notifications for the product. Initially, my colleague who was designing this before I joined her, she made this mock-up of how in-app notifications were supposed to work in the product, and you can see that here we have a notification panel with all these different notifications, and you can do some things with them like mark them as unread. And she did some initial testing with just this static mockup, and admittedly the results were skewed or were influenced by the fact that it was static, it was not interactive. So, for example, people didn't understand some interactions like the aforementioned mark as unread, but they also couldn't really relate to the content of the mockup, because this was, maybe we can call it realistic looking data, yeah? But they couldn't relate to it because it wasn't their own. And at roughly the same time, we were debating in our team what kinds of prototyping tools we could be using. And an idea surfaced that we could use these live data prototypes because we actually used them before, at least one time, and it was a success. So we said, why not? Let's give it a shot here. This looks like a really good project for that because notifications are heavily relying on user data. So we said, okay, let's try it. What we did was that we wanted to build a prototype with some changes. And before we did that, we actually went and made the testing script first so that we knew what exactly to prototype. Because with these live data prototypes, as I said, you need the help of developers. And that time, their time is costly, and you want to minimize that time, So it was really crucial to have a good idea of what we really needed to prototype and what we could fake in the prototype and what not. So that we then went to a development team and we were trying to sell the idea to them of prototyping like this. And it really helped that some designers on our team had previous experience of working or doing such prototype. And that allowed us to do two crucial things. One is to really align on the scope of the prototype. And I'm gonna go a little bit more into detail on that in a second. And the other was that we really had to carefully explain that the prototype code isn't nearly as the same as production code. Prototype code is something that you will most likely throw away, or most of it you will throw away at the very end. And you don't need to keep that same quality of code as you would do for production code. So for this specific prototype, what we did was that we pulled in real users and real content item names from the database, so that when we ran the prototype, user would log in and they would see the data they normally see, their colleagues' names, the content item names that they work on. However, in the notification panel, and I think it would be best if I actually showed you what the prototype looked like. So let's see here. Okay, here, this is a running version of the product, and I have the prototype right here in the bottom left corner. You see this nice icon that's showing me how many unread notifications I have. This is an actual number that's calculated based on the number of notifications that I have there. Let's wait a little bit until it loads. I hope that it loads. It's taking some time. Okay, nice. So, and here we see all these different notifications, and they actually contain names of, as I said, real content items in this project, as well as names of other users on this project, which is great because, as I said, this really helps users during user testing to feel familiar in that environment. And this prototype is pretty interactive. You can mark something as read, mark something as unread. You can even click through and open that content item. So it works pretty much like normal. The key difference, though, is that the events that would trigger these notifications are fake. So here, nobody actually mentioned me. That event is fake. Only the name and the content item name is real. And when we were first talking to developers about doing this prototype, they actually thought they were gonna go and build a whole platform for the notifications, do these real events that would fire these notifications. And we had to stop them and say, oh, whoa, we don't need that. Like, these events can be fake. We just need the usernames and the content item names to make it look real. And in that moment, the complexity of the prototype really went down, and that really helped us. So let me just quickly go back to the presentation. Yeah, so this was very important to explain, and it allowed us to be much more efficient to do that prototype. I think it took the team not even a week, I think, to make this prototype. I think one person worked on it mainly. And if I imagine doing that prototype, and for example in Axure with that level of interactivity, I think it would have taken me almost as much time as it did to do this prototype, and that's without the benefit of using live data, obviously. So once we had this prototype, we went to user test it. And here, before we started testing, we actually had this fear that maybe people will not be okay with sharing their data. And that can happen, obviously. We were fortunate that it didn't happen during this round of user testing, but it could have easily happened that someone wouldn't be comfortable with showing us their data inside their projects, or maybe even recording the session, So we had to have a backup handy. We actually had a separate instance of that prototype with a sample project, which, if we had to use it, would go against the idea of using live data, but we had to have that backup. Otherwise, if something happened and someone wouldn't be comfortable with using the prototype with their own data, it wouldn't lead to nothing. So when we actually did the test, it was pretty clear from the onset that people could really relate to the content immediately, and that's great because it enabled some key insights. For example, the biggest insight we got from this was that one participant was working with the prototype, and I'm gonna just quickly switch to the prototype so you can imagine it better. They were working with it, and they saw the content item names that they usually work with. And in that particular instance, they were used to working with different language variants of those content items. And when you have those language variants, you usually have the language written in brackets at the end of the name. And they didn't see that. And so they said, oh, so which language variant did this new comment appear for? And that's when we realized, oh, we have to include that information. This is the kind of insight that wouldn't be possible if we didn't use live data, because it was the fact that the participants saw their own content item names that they are used to seeing, that made them realize, oh, there's something missing here. There's something that I'm used to and it's not there. So that was the kind of insight that was really enabled by live data. So if I had to share a couple of lessons from prototyping like this, it would be these. The first one is that it can give you much better results during user testing, because these prototypes really offer really big fidelity. They can be really interactive, and that's great. And obviously, there's that benefit of live data and familiarity of environment for people that you are testing with. However, and that's lesson number 2, they are not a cure for all. You should know when to use them. I mentioned that the best use case for these is when you need to validate something that's relying heavily on user data. You wouldn't want to use a prototype like this just for anything, especially because as you need your developers' help with that, that time is usually pretty expensive, and you don't want to squander that time. However, at the same time, if you are looking for including developers in the process and the use case for the prototype happens to be aligning with what these live data prototypes are great for, it's actually a really good way of including developers in the process, because it also makes them more invested in the process, and they are even more likely to participate in the subsequent user testing, which is good. Now, if you wanted to go and try prototyping like this in your team, let me share a couple of tips that I can, based on our experience. The first one is you should always explain the difference between a prototype and production code, at least the first time that you are doing this, because I think in teams they can be really used to making the code as good as possible, and in case of prototyping, that's undesirable. We know that the prototype might be thrown away completely if the user testing doesn't work, or if it uncovers some big issues, for example. And at the end of the day, the same code will not be used in production. So it's totally okay to cut corners. It's totally okay to lower the quality of code, to sacrifice it for speed and efficiency. At the same time, it's also very good to limit the scope, to be really intentional with what exactly you want to prototype. Because as I said, that time is precious and you don't want to waste it. So you should really define at the very beginning of the project, or before you start prototyping, what do you actually need to prototype, and only prototype that and nothing else. And even then, you should be careful about what can be fake and what needs to be real in the prototype. And when you are actually user testing, you should be prepared for the worst. We were lucky that we could use the live data prototype with no objections from our participants. So we didn't have to use that backup prototype, but you should always be expecting the worst and be prepared for that. And so with that, we covered pretty much everything. I want to thank you for listening. And I guess that we have some questions in Sli.do, so let's head over there and see if there is anything that you would like to get answered. If you miss the information at the very beginning, you can go to Sli.do and you can post your questions there. You can use the hashtag #DesignHour, and let's see if there are any questions. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit more time to ask any questions if you should have any. Let's see if Sli.do loads. Okay, well, amazingly, it seems that there are no questions yet. I don't know if I really covered everything that you would like to know about choosing a prototyping tool or working with live data prototypes. But okay, some questions are popping up. Good. Let's see. So, do you like to use paper prototypes in any cases? If yes, what for? If not, why? Well, that's a good question. I personally use paper prototypes very, very sparingly. I find that the time to do a paper prototype sometimes isn't as, or let me rephrase that. The time to make a prototype in some other tools or in that higher fidelity is usually, for me, roughly the same, which may sound surprising, but I always try to aim for that little bit higher fidelity because I also believe that it gives me better results in general. It doesn't have to be as high fidelity as live data prototypes or any prototype that lives in code, but yeah, I'm not that big of a fan of paper prototypes. They can have their place in the design process, but I don't usually use them. So another question is if we were able to reuse the live prototype in the production code. Well, we haven't actually, I think, started implementing that. And the one thing that we would probably use from that prototype would be the styling. That probably wouldn't change a lot, or based on the results that we got from the user testing, it wouldn't change a lot. So we would probably reuse the styling, but not much apart from that. Okay, let me see some other questions that are here. What about design systems? Do you always create ad hoc prototypes for specific tasks, or do you keep a set of components somewhere? How do you choose where? That's a really good question. When it comes to design system, we are currently working on one in Kentico. So we don't have a real design system yet, but we do have a component library in Sketch that we use when we are designing something that contains the most common components that we need to work with. Yeah. What was the most fun you've ever had with prototyping? Ooh, that's a really good question. I think the most fun I had was, I think that was like a year and a half ago. I had to prototype this flow of creating a image password for a security app, and I did that in Framer because of some technical constraints that I needed the prototype to have, and that was really fun because I had plenty of time to do that. You know, at that time I wasn't really working in an agile environment yet, and so thanks to that I had a lot of time to play around with it. Because I needed the interaction to get it just right to user test it, because I would be testing some very specific things there. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Okay, let's see what other questions there might be. Which tool would you recommend for beginners who are trying to learn prototyping from scratch? I would definitely recommend picking up a tool that's very easy to learn. But it really depends on your background. So I would generally advise against some really complex tools or some that usually have a very steep learning curve like Framer or Axure. However, if your background is in web development, you might find Framer very easy to pick up. So that really depends. But in general, I think tools like InVision that are really just clicking around would be best for beginners, I think. Next question would be, have you considered putting that set of questions into a form of a decision tree or something similar, having the prototyping tools as the leaves? That's a really good idea. I might do that one day when I have a lot of time on my hands. However, with the sheer volume of tools that are available on the market, I think it would be quite complex to do something like that. But yeah, it's definitely a good idea, and maybe it can be done with just a couple of tools as a start. So another one: have you ever tried Adobe XD? If so, what do you think about it? I haven't personally spent enough time with it to make a qualified review, so I can't really say. But what I heard is great about Adobe XD is that it allows for voice prototyping, which can be really useful. And if we go back to the idea of answering those questions about what exactly you need a prototype to do, if you need to prototype something with voice, Adobe XD might actually be a very good fit. Okay, what's next for you in prototyping? What would you like to try or learn? As I mentioned, I'm currently learning to code. I'm currently learning some JavaScript, and I believe it can be really useful to know some code, either to prototype directly in that, or as a starting point for learning tools like FramerX, for example. That's a tool that I see as very promising and that I want to explore more. So yeah, learning to code, that's next for me in prototyping. What happened to the live prototype after the testing? Was it used for actual development later? Yeah, we touched on that already. We aren't like actively reusing anything from it apart from the styling, I think. And another question, you mentioned a graph showing how much time you should use on creating a prototype. Please be honest, can you actually recognize where is your productive peak? Yeah, well, if we go back, that graph was actually not about how much time you should spend on creating a prototype. It was a graph showing that with more relevance of the data that you use, like real data or live data, it's more difficult to work with it. So it requires a bit more time. But if I can actually recognize where is my productive peak, well, I would say that I'm most productive when I know exactly what the prototype is going to do instead of just exploring what else could I prototype about this. If I defined beforehand the kinds of interactions that I need to do, or what exactly do I need to prototype to do, like am I going to use variables? Am I going to use some conditional logic or something like that? If I define it beforehand, I am much more productive then. Okay, good. So it seems like that was the last question. I would like to thank you guys again very, very much for tuning in. And I would encourage you to follow our team on Twitter at Kentico Design if you want to hear about updates about the next design hour, which I hope will be soon. So thank you guys again for tuning in and have a great day. Bye.